If Congress can't even keep airport security fully funded, what exactly is Washington in control of right now? Because that's where this story lands. The U.S. Senate just passed a bipartisan deal to fund most of the Department of Homeland Security and ease the pressure on TSA, but House Republicans, led by Speaker Mike Johnson and backed by immigration hardliners, rejected it anyway. And while politicians keep fighting, the people feeling it, first are not in the Capitol. They're standing in airport security lines, missing flights, and wondering why one of the most basic functions of government is being treated like a bargaining chip. And the part that makes this bigger than one ugly budget fight is simple. This is no longer just about funding, it's about power. It's about who controls the Republican agenda, what gets tied to immigration politics, and whether basic public systems now have to break before Washington decides they matter. Stay with this, because by the end, the real story is not just why this deal failed, it's why some people in Washington may believe the chaos is politically useful. Right now, this matters because the damage is no longer theoretical. The Senate's overnight deal was designed to do one thing: stop the pain where it was becoming most visible. It would fund major DHS functions like TSA and other core operations while leaving the biggest political fight, immigration enforcement, outside the compromise. In plain English, the Senate tried to separate airport security and public-facing disruption from the much more explosive battle over ICE and border enforcement that was the off-ramp. The House decided not to take it, and that tells you a lot. Because once a bipartisan Senate deal exists, the question is no longer can Congress pass something. The question becomes who benefits from keeping this unresolved? That is where this story stops being boring budget process and starts becoming a real political stress test for the Republican Party, for Trump, and for the country's patience. The first thing to understand is what actually happened. The Senate moved after weeks of pressure tied to the partial DHS shutdown. TSA officers have been working through the disruption, staffing has been strained, and major airports have already seen visible delays. Travel industry groups have been warning Congress that asking frontline security staff to keep working without stable pay is reckless, especially during heavy travel periods. The pressure was building fast, and the Senate finally acted. Then the House GOP essentially said, "Not good enough." Speaker Mike Johnson and House hardliners rejected the Senate bill because it did not include the kind of immigration enforcement funding and priorities they wanted, especially around ICE and border-related operations. So even though the Senate compromise would have relieved pressure on airports and TSA, House Republicans treated it as politically unacceptable because it split airport security from the larger immigration fight. That's the key point. This was not a case where Washington had no option on the table. There was an option. It passed the Senate. It had bipartisan support. It was sitting there, and the House rejected it because for some Republicans, keeping DHS funding tied to immigration leverage is more important than quickly ending the visible breakdown at airports. But here's the part almost nobody is talking about. The public does not experience government shutdown politics through legislative text. They experience it through systems failing in real time. Nobody at the airport is standing there thinking about parliamentary procedure. They're thinking, why is this line not moving? Why are fewer checkpoints open? Why does this feel like the country is running on fumes? That is how political dysfunction becomes politically dangerous. It stops being abstract and becomes personal, and once that happens, the blame game gets a lot harder to control. Now, Trump stepped into this by ordering that TSA employees be paid regardless of Congress. That move matters politically because it allows him to say, "I'm acting while Congress fights," but it also creates a second problem. If the White House is forced to patch over a congressional failure through executive action, it only underlines how broken the legislative process has become. It may ease some short-term pain for TSA workers, but it does not solve the underlying standoff, and that brings us to the second layer of this story, which is where it gets much more strategic. This is not just a funding dispute, it's an internal Republican power struggle playing out in public. On paper, Republicans control the House. In practice, House leadership still has to survive the demands of a smaller but highly disruptive bloc of hardliners who can blow up almost any compromise they dislike. Mike Johnson is not just negotiating with Democrats or the Senate. He is negotiating with his own right flank every single time a major bill hits the floor, and that means even deals that make obvious practical sense can become politically toxic inside his own conference. That's why this fight matters more than it first appears, because it shows that even when Republicans have a chance to claim a partial win, reduce public pain, and say they protected core security functions, they still may not be able to close the deal if the compromise doesn't satisfy the most aggressive demands on immigration. That is a major signal for what comes next on every other must-pass issue this year. If the House GOP cannot accept a Senate-approved off-ramp on something as publicly visible as airport security, then future battles over border policy, appropriations, emergency spending, and even election year governance are going to be far more volatile than most voters probably realize. Now this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The Senate deal itself reveals something important about where the political center actually is right now. Even in a deeply polarized Congress, there was enough support to carve out TSA and other DHS functions from the immigration fight. That means some lawmakers in both parties understand that when the public starts seeing operational failure, the political cost rises fast. In other words, the Senate was reacting to visible consequences. The House, at least for now, is still reacting to ideological pressure. And those are two very different political clocks. One clock says, fix the thing that's breaking. The other says, don't give up leverage. And in Washington, leverage often wins until the public anger gets loud enough. That is why airport lines matter far beyond travel. They are one of the few things in American politics that can turn a budget fight into a broad public backlash almost overnight. People may tune out congressional process, they do not tune out missed flights. Exhausted workers, and obvious dysfunction in a national security system they depend on. And what happened next changed the entire calculation, because once Trump moved to guarantee TSA pay, the political optics shifted. Before that, Republicans risked being seen as holding frontline security workers hostage to a policy fight. After that move, the White House gained a talking point that it was stepping in to protect the workers while Congress remained stuck. But there's a catch: if executive action becomes the workaround every time Congress deadlocks. That doesn't show strength, it shows institutional decay. It means the system only functions when somebody improvises around it, and that should concern people on both sides of the aisle. Because whether you're conservative, moderate, or liberal, there should be some minimum level of agreement that airport screening, transportation security, and basic homeland operations should not be repeatedly dragged into brinkmanship. If every essential function becomes a pressure point, then government stops being a governing system and starts becoming a permanent hostage negotiation. The third part of this story is the most important one: what this could mean next. In the short term, this likely means more instability, more uncertainty for travelers, and more pressure on lawmakers to find a face-saving way out. If the House insists on attaching broader immigration demands while the Senate insists on a narrower operational fix, the gap stays open, and the longer that gap stays open, the more politically expensive it gets for everyone involved. But the bigger consequence is what this says about governing in 2026. America is entering another period where basic state capacity is becoming a political weapon. That phrase sounds technical, but it really just means this: the ability of the government to do ordinary, necessary things is now being folded into ideological warfare, not just immigration policy, not just spending levels, the actual day-to-day functioning of institutions people rely on. That is a dangerous habit for any country, and especially for a superpower trying to project stability at home and credibility abroad, because allies watch this too, markets watch this too, and voters definitely watch this too. When a country cannot cleanly fund homeland operations without dragging airport security, worker pay, and public trust into the blast zone, that sends a message, and it's not a message of strength. It's a message that internal political incentives are now overriding basic operational discipline that matters economically as well. Travel disruptions don't just annoy people, they ripple airlines, business travel, tourism, airport staffing, and supply chains all get hit when security systems become unstable, and once travelers start adjusting behavior around uncertainty, the economic cost spreads beyond Washington almost immediately. That is exactly why the travel industry has been sounding the alarm, and politically, this could become a much larger problem for Republicans if they are not careful. Why? Because there is a point where fighting hard stops looking like principle and starts looking like dysfunction. That line is not always easy to see inside Washington, but voters usually see it very clearly once daily life gets worse. If Republicans want this fight to strengthen them, they have to convince the public that the pain is necessary, temporary, and clearly tied to a bigger objective worth the cost. That is a very hard sell when the visible symptom is a TSA line wrapping through an airport terminal, and for Democrats, there's a lesson here too. They may get short-term political advantage from highlighting the dysfunction, but if they want to win the broader argument, they still have to show that their version of government can actually function under pressure. In this environment, voters are not just rewarding ideology, they are rewarding competence, or at least punishing the absence of it. That is the deeper battlefield now, not left versus right alone, but order versus breakdown, function versus paralysis, reality versus messaging, and that brings us back to the central promise at the beginning. The real story here is not just that House Republicans rejected a Senate DHES deal. The real story is that Washington had a limited practical fix sitting on the table and still chose escalation. That tells you this fight is no longer being driven mainly by what solves the immediate problem. It's being driven by who gets to define the terms of surrender inside the Republican Party, who controls the immigration narrative going into the next major battles, and who is willing to absorb public anger in the meantime. That is the bigger picture. Airport lines are not the whole story. They are the warning light on the dashboard, and when a government starts ignoring the warning lights because the internal political fight feels more important, that's when small dysfunction can become something much bigger. So if you're watching this and wondering what it really means, the answer is simple. This is a test of whether America's political system can still separate essential public operations from partisan warfare. Right now, the answer does not look especially reassuring. If you want more clear, independent political analysis without the cable news shouting, subscribe now, and I want to ask you one direct question. Who do you think voters will blame more if this keeps dragging on House Republicans, Senate leaders, or Trump? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you know someone who follows U.S. politics closely, share this with them, because this story is about a lot more than airport lines.